Thank you. Uh, Thank you for the invitation, Emily, David, to the group. It's so incredibly wonderful to see everyone. So as Emily mentioned, I was at UNC from 97 to 2000. So those were the years right after I graduated from the University of Virginia. It is really funny to think about having been gone for a full 20 years now, partly because UNC had such an outsized influence, I think, on my life and my work. I am still working really closely with Beth Kurtz-Coase. My very first honor student, Dr. Shauna Cooper, is here. Yeah, so worked with Shauna when she was an undergrad. So what a wonderful way to come back. And Margaret, student from Michigan. So it's just wonderful to see everyone and to be here and talk about my work with you all and think about what we all can do in terms of racial justice. So I'm excited to be here. I do have slides, but I have a fairly informal kind of a set of slides. So feel free to interrupt if you would like, to ask questions or to make comments. Right. So I was reflecting on my 27-year-old self at UNC here, putting this talk together as I was thinking about joining you. And yeah, really odd to think I used to be 27. So making systemic change for social justice in higher ed. So when I talked to David about the kind of purpose here, he was saying some people are going to be doing research talks and some people would be doing more talks about administration and leadership. And so I thought I would do a little bit of both, not really talk about my research, but talk a little bit about how my research has informed my thinking as an administrator, as what I think of a bit as an activist administrator. I would not have considered myself an activist administrator until I got here. I'll say more about that. So I want to make 3 points today. The first is that racial justice work must be structural. That, okay, I just have to say hi to Louis. Hi, Louis. Sorry, it's a reunion.
Yeah.
So the work has to be structural. So we really have to think about how we build structures and institutionalize them, as opposed to focusing only on individual instances and how we might help individual people. The second is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is the enemy of justice, which is an exaggeration, but we'll think about how I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives often undermine principles of justice. And then the third thing is really that you can build a justice agenda for yourself, but that I would encourage everyone to think about this as a body of work and an agenda as opposed to sort of a reaction to a set of circumstances, which I think we often end up reacting to things, which is, is not inherently bad, but I think we can have a proactive agenda that we build. So my research, over the years since I was in graduate school, I've been really interested in issues of race and gender and how children and others make sense of themselves in the world in terms of race and gender. I've been very focused on parents and how parents' understanding of the world and how race and gender operate influence their socialization of their children. And so if you understand that the world is going to react to your child in a particular way based on their race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, etc., then you're probably going to try to prepare them for that world in particular ways. Here recently, my students and I have started thinking a lot about socio-political development. And so that is not just thinking about stereotypes and not just developing a worldview about race and gender, but especially thinking about how disparities and inequality develop and how those disparities may reflect structural inequality as opposed to any individual's efforts or limitations or shortcomings. So there are a lot of these models. We think a lot about models of critical consciousness or these larger models that are focused on activism as an ultimate outcome. So the work essentially suggests that when we think about disparities as being structural in nature, as reflecting structural oppression, whether that's based on race or gender or sexual orientation, social class, then we're more likely to be activist. So civic engagement is often spurred by our understanding that systemic and structural forces are at work in shaping the world as it is. On the other hand, we have more individual attributions, beliefs that disparities are a reflection of individual shortcomings, ability or lack of effort, and so on and so forth. So when I think about it in terms of my work as a leader, I think that my understanding that it is these structural and systemic forces in higher education that lead to so many disparities. I think it gives me a different sense of how to dismantle that. So rather than focusing on an individual, thinking about how to build policies and procedures and an ethic of care that includes dismantling these structural structures that undermine racial justice. And a lot of the work that we're doing is suggesting that awareness of inequality shapes attribution. So a lot of the work that Beth and I, all of the work that Beth and I do is related to the development of attributions. And so that understanding of inequality shapes how you make sense of what happens to other people. And that then leads to action. In our work, we actually are looking more at motivation, not action as an outcome. But in my leadership work, I think about how to spur people to action. And then finally, the beliefs are shaped in social context, and that higher education is a broad social context where we come to understand how inequality develops. And I believe it can be a setting where we can push against people's beliefs in important ways. It's funny that I think of, as I mentioned, thinking of myself as an activist. So I met with the department chairs yesterday, and we were having conversations about problems that were, it's too hard to hire somebody, too much red tape in the research office, those kinds of things that department chairs complain about. And I stopped the conversation and said, what can we do as a collective? What would our collective voice mean in raising these concerns? And how can we put together an agenda to move forward to make some change? And A, I recognized that I wasn't actually part of the group because I'm the dean and provost. I'm not a department chair. And B, I realized that I was inviting the department chairs to sort of move against me. But the point is, I think that understanding of systems leads to action. So my first point is really this idea that we need to develop structure. And what I mean by that is that, if you think about higher education in particular, the very roots of higher education are in oppression, right? So the earliest institutions of higher education were meant to elevate certain people, and they were very exclusionary. They, lots of people weren't allowed in on purpose for a really long time. And so there's no surprise then, as things have evolved and we've moved into thinking about higher education as like the great equalizer, it's not surprising that those same folks who were systematically excluded before aren't necessarily overtly excluded, but rather the things that we value, the things that we care about, the way that resources are apportioned, our understanding of what is important, our understanding of what is knowledge, and the voices that are really at the table are not built for those folks. And so helping individuals is good, but helping build a system is better. I think a recent example is thinking about the murder of Brianna Taylor, which is, it's just shocking to me that we continue to have these issues with police brutality and violence. And people have mounted many really effective protests, which has been great. And you can see in some cases, justice has been achieved in the outcome, and in some cases not. And so you can see if we're just focusing on the individual case, then, sort of a sometimes you win, sometimes you don't situation. But if we step back and say, what can we do to actually change the system, then it's a totally different conversation. So developing a structure. So, I think the first stage of developing a structure is really thinking about our pipeline. So when we think about why we don't have more scholars of color or students of color, I think a part of what's happening is people say, well, we don't have a pipeline, we don't have enough people out there, and so we can't do it, which I think is a big cop-out. First, because we are the ones in charge of the pipeline. So what are we doing with our own pipelines to build capacity? So I think about programs like URAP. I think about how the University of Michigan benefited from the University of North Carolina having an amazing URAP program, because we took all your graduates and then made them our students. Likewise, Michigan has a variety of different pipeline programs that have been really effective. I think a second piece of structure is empowering allies. I think so often people don't get involved because they think, A, it's not my work. But I think the bigger thing is, I don't want to screw it up. So I don't want to be the person who stands in front of the class trying to lead a conversation on racial justice and say something wrong, say something offensive. And so I think that empowering allies means, first of all, saying that this is work that we all need to take up. I think that even in the way that this invitation was structured made me think that there were some subtle nods to, thinking about centering voices of people of color, but also inviting everyone to the table to have the conversation, I think is really a critical piece. But when people come to the table, you also want to make sure that they're ready. So I think that all too often when we think about racial justice work, we think about it as well-intentioned action. So, the wokeness. So I've read some books. I have some good Black friends. I'm ready to go out and do some work. And in fact, I think about this work as a science, really. There's a lot of literature out, we know some stuff and how and what works and what doesn't. And so approaching racial justice work with good intentions is just completely wrong-headed, because oftentimes you get in there and you do screw things up because you're not rooted and grounded in something. And so I think part of empowering allies means that we all need to get ourselves together, educate ourselves, have these conversations, and then also have some tools. So how do we arm folks who are ready to go out and do this work? How do we prepare people to have open conversations about things that they may not know everything about, that are intimidating? I think sometimes we err on the side of the sort of color blindness approach where people don't say anything, like pretend it's not out there. Or you have people, marching into battle who really don't have the tools to have the conversation. So I'm a big advocate of training and being prepared to go into the work, but also being willing to sort of make some mistakes. And we'll talk about the mistake making a little bit later. The other thing is just avoid ghettoizing the work. Everyone has a diversity committee, and you want to get to the point where it's not just the diversity committee that is doing the work. We want to make sure that everyone is sort of carrying the torch. so that the work, first of all, that the work represents the collective, but also so that the work doesn't become just what people of color, the allies, the woke group does, but that everyone understands that they have a role. And then this point about institutionalization. So I'll talk a little bit later about this, but when I was in graduate school, my mentor, Robert Sellers, started a conference for Black graduate students. And I remember a moment after maybe 3 or 4 years when he and his colleagues who started the conference said, you know what, we aren't going to do this forever. We can't do this forever. We shouldn't do this forever. We should bring on some other folks who are willing to get involved. And then we should build a structure that makes sure that it happens every year and that we have sort of a manual. So we help the folks who are sponsoring the conference. It's been all over the country. And the folks who sponsor the conference get information about how to do fundraising, how to do application review, and those sorts of things, which means now there are, we're probably on our 3rd generation. So I think this is a 28th year of this conference. And it is institutionalized. It is out there, and there's a movement with the conference, but only because someone said, this can't just be mine. It has to be owned by some collective. Other sorts of programs, you want to make sure that even in thinking about budgets, rather than pulling together budgets to do diversity work, we want to have line items that are really dedicated toward the work so that every chair who comes into the department says, oh, here is money that is meant for this work. And so I need to carry this agenda forward. And so institutionalizing the structures. And then finally, using data. As I mentioned, this is work that can be done badly. I think people are well-intentioned and then do things that we know based on research are ineffective. And there's pretty good evidence that implicit bias training, on average, isn't super effective. But we feel really good about it, and there are ways to do it well. So this is not you shouldn't do implicit bias training at all, but you want to know how to do it well and use that as your guidepost, those data. You want to collect your own data. How are you doing, and what are the metrics by which you can measure your success? As opposed to willy-nilly doing things that feel good. Mentoring programs are fantastic, but are your mentoring programs effective? Are the students you're mentoring, your faculty you're mentoring, getting to the places that you're hoping to send them? So data, I think, has to be a cornerstone of structure. The other thing that data does for a bunch of academics is really it brings people along. When you see disparities in numbers, oftentimes it conjures a different view than if you describe disparities without the data. So I spent 20 years at the University of Michigan. In addition, I spent 4 years there as an undergraduate student. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this issue around institutionalization and structure with an example. So many of you know Michigan is, we think, still the largest psychology department in the country. So we have almost 100 faculty. I say we because I was an undergrad there. It's my alma mater, not because I'm still there, but I always say we. Michigan has the distinction of being in the top 10 for racial diversity of the faculty and probably the graduate students as well. Certainly not even close on the undergrads. Highly diverse faculty. So when I left, there were 12 Black full professors. There were another 7 Latinx full professors. We had 5 Asian full professors, 2 Indigenous. So when I say we were a diverse faculty, we were as diverse as possible. And we were consistently, for the past, as long as I can remember, ranked in the top 5. And so when people say things like, where's the pipeline? Or, everybody's having the same problem, I cry, word I shouldn't say, but, I call people's bluff on that. The bottom line is there is a pipeline. It's meager, But at Michigan, we tried to build the pipeline. And the second thing is, once people got there, there was a real commitment to equity and inclusion. So Pat Gurin, the woman centered in the middle there, was the chair who hired me. Pat actually, the year I came in, there were 5 scholars of color who came in at the same time into tenure track roles, 7 people recruited total. During Pat's time, I think she probably saw the largest group of faculty of color move through the tenure line, and all but 2 of the folks that she hired during that period are now full professors, and many have gone on to active administrative careers and other sorts of things. The bottom line is, she said, let's look at tenure and promotion. What's happening there? And how do we make it more equitable? How do people get resources? And let's make sure that everyone has the resources that they need, and that we lower the bar so that people aren't having to ask so much as making things available to everyone. So we know the back door in the academy is the way that certain people continue to get resources and other people are left out. And you can imagine who feels empowered to come to the chair to ask for things. She was, really intense on mentoring. And she was the first person I really ever heard talk extensively about people trapped in the associate professor level and what we need to do to mentor associate professors. Her husband, Jerry, is there to the right of her. He was also really huge in terms of leading to the diversity. He was not in psychology, he was in education, but to diversity in Michigan and building structures like the Institute for Social Research, where he really played a key role. James Jackson on the left was one of my undergraduate mentors. He just recently passed away. He built the first National Center on Black Americans, the first nationally representative study of longitudinal nationally representative study of Black Americans back in the 70s. And so to think that he built a structure for Black scholars in particular to move through tenure and promotion, and really to get outstanding training and to have a voice in terms of public health kinds of issues was really astounding at the time that he was doing his work. It was really touching to me to see his obituary in the New York Times just recently, just thinking about the outsized influence that he's had for racial justice and thinking about training scholars of color, but also framing issues around public health for people of color more broadly. One of the things that he did was he was one of the first people to say, we can talk about Black people without a white control group. And that was really astounding at the time. And then of course my mentor, Rob Sellers, who I know that many of you know. So Rob was actually James's student, and he also worked with Pat. But Rob and I met at University of Virginia. Oddly enough, we were at Michigan at the same time, didn't know each other, went to UVA, where he was my mentor, but not my advisor. He's now the Chief Diversity Officer at Michigan. He started as a graduate student doing this work on racial justice. And in particular, he started an organization for Black graduate students. He helped to found our first Latino Student Psychological Association. He started in the early 1990s as a graduate student, our Minority Visitation Weekend. So my point is this, that these are individuals who came in and made a tremendous difference. These are kind of workaday folks, just like the rest of us, who said, I have a thing I want to do for racial justice, and they built lasting structures that will be there long beyond. And they did something that meant that the University of Michigan could have such a diverse faculty that, at the same time as being recognized for academic excellence. So just to say, you can do it too. So I said that DEI work is sort of the enemy of justice. Slight exaggeration. Many of you are familiar with the Grutter versus Bollinger Supreme Court case of 2003. This is important because prior to this case, And, in higher education in general, we were focused on racial justice in the form of affirmative action. So the idea was to go out and affirmatively both help to develop and recruit people from marginalized communities. And at the time, it was marginalization in terms of race and gender. As we move forward through the 90s, that became an unpalatable position. So some people felt like affirmative action was a stigma for people who either did or didn't receive it, but who were from marginalized communities. And there was a belief that we could do better by really focusing more on diversity and the value of diversity over racial justice. And a lot of what happened after this period was that we started to focus on what I call the contribution or the most superficial aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is diversity. Just who's here? Do we have enough of this group and that group and that group? It also took us to this point of really thinking about diversity as a contribution to the university, as opposed to higher ed being a resource for marginalized folks. So the figure on the right is from James Banks. I won't belabor the point, but this is actually a model of multicultural education. At the very bottom is the contribution. That is where there's a belief, and this is really for K-12 teachers, but there's a belief that the way to lead to multicultural education is to, trot out Che Guevara or Martin Luther King, have kids, do their hands and color them in special crayons. So saying like people of color or women had a contribution here. The problem with that is it's incredibly superficial. I think likewise, universities have contributions in the form of diversity classes. So everybody has to take a class on race and ethnicity in order to graduate. So there's something over here in the corner that is meant to help us in some way because people of color are important in some way, but not necessarily to spur us to action. And so the top of this multicultural education pyramid is really where we get from contribution to really having more integration of that material into the curriculum, to really having it woven into the fabric of the course, to really to the point where you get people thinking for themselves about what racial justice or multiculturalism really means. So I think that diversity leaves us at the contribution level. This assumption that, people of color matter, they're nice to have around, we make better decisions when we're more diverse, that sort of thing. And it puts this onus on really the people of color to be helpful in some way, as opposed to thinking about action and structure. So these two books came out about the University of Michigan. So Pat Gurin, again, my former chair and friend, wrote the book Defending Diversity as part of the lead up to the affirmative action cases. Again, the focus was really on the value of diversity. So more diverse organizations are more productive and more creative, and everyone benefits from diversity. Has nothing to do with racial justice. And in fact, Matthew Johnson more recently came out with this book about the University of Michigan, how one university embraced inclusion and inequality. So what has happened at Michigan is even as we have, this is outside the psychology department, I can see how the stories would get confusing, but when you think about the undergraduate population in particular, we have increasing, skyrocketing even, income inequality, declining racial diversity, and a declining sense of inclusion, even after we had these amazing Supreme Court cases that pushed the value of diversity. So the diversity rhetoric has undermined racial justice. We'll talk more about that later. And then finally, I just wanted to talk to you about you and thinking about your work. So where do you take all of this? So one, I think that we all have to start with this point of education, of healing, um, of understanding your role, your position, your identities. I think that's really critical so that you can be more than just well-intentioned, that you can be ready to get in there and make a difference. I think the second thing is taking humble risks. I think cultural humility is critical. Understanding that we don't know everything about other groups and about what's important to other people, or even everyone else's history. And we can't do enough education ever that we ever get to the point where we know everything. So at some point, you're going to have to step out and try some things, but with humility that says, I'm going to screw this up in some ways, but asking people to roll with you. And people, students, classrooms, people are happy to go with you. I think in this time of cancel culture, sometimes it can be really intimidating. But I think that if people see you making an effort, they will hang with you. Third, engaging in courageous conversations is part of that. I think that just reading books and going to webinars is not enough to build your skill. You got to try some things out in conversation, ask questions, talk to real people, continue to take risks, then get feedback from real people, so that you build your muscle, so that you build a set of tools that work for you. Just a reminder to center equity and justice. And when I talk about equity, I mean really thinking who's at the table, who's making decisions, whose voice is centered, what assumptions are we making about how things operate, and where are those assumptions coming from? Who's our audience? So who are we talking to when we're doing these things? And how does that matter in terms of the way that we put together an agenda? And then how are resources allocated? And is there transparency? Does everyone understand all of the rules? Where are those nooks and crannies where people are getting additional mentoring? When I was in graduate school, we found out that the fraternities had these cabinets filled with old exams from one of our famed psychology faculty members who just used the same exams every year, but he would sort of have them in like a 10-year rotation. And so you go to the fraternity house, you would look through all the exams, and then every question on the new exam would have been represented in the old exams. And so some students got together and just made a public repository, much to the chagrin of the faculty member. But where are we doing that? Where are we just laying bare the rules that we hold so tightly? And how are we inviting people in? Avoiding charity. I think it's really easy to imagine that we're doing this good work for these poor orphan children, but remembering that our partners have integrity and they have things to contribute, and what they have to contribute may look quite different from what you are bringing to the table. But you want to check yourself and think about how much space you're taking up and to what extent you're allowing other people to set the agenda, and even what your motivations are. Is your motivation really racial justice, or is it the sort of gold star pat on the back that you get from your wokeness? And then finally, I'd invite everyone to build an agenda. I think part of the problem is one, we're too reactive in the work, but I also think that we tend to be willy-nilly. So if I go back to Pat Gurin, she said, I want to build a psychology department that is incredibly diverse, that brings the very best scholars of color together, and that supports them through their entire career. And she set out to do that as an agenda. You can't do everything, and so I think that a lot of folks are often doing a few things well, or too many things not well. And so having a set of metrics and a set of questions that you're grappling with is an effective way to start. And that is the end of my formal presentation. Do you have questions? Thank you. It's really funny to hear everybody clap on mute.
So we have until 1:15, and all of this time can be used for discussion, and anyone is welcome to jump in, either in the chat or just unmute yourself.
I'll monitor the chat, so if people have questions there, I can read them out.
I have one question to get us started, maybe. And I, as a student, have less insight into like what happens at the admin level and how these unfold from like a top-down way. But I'm reflecting on the last slide that you just showed and how I think everyone, at least in our program and I think across programs, are trying to make all of these changes at the same time, but some of them seem like they're a little sequential. So I'm thinking specifically of like the personal healing work that happens on the individual level, and then something like avoiding charity, which is kind of a philosophy that can be really hard to operationalize. And like, so I feel like the personal work happens to transform the like solidarity, not charity perspective. And so I guess the question is kind of broad, but like, on what timeline do you wait for these to unfold? And like, yeah, I don't know, just like, how long are we waiting for them to like sequentially happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that I have learned is so it's interesting to think about the last, let's take the last 20 years of history. So since I left UNC, Peter, hi, sorry. So thinking about the last 20 years of history, I think for me, as someone, so thinking about the fact that I felt like there was sort of a solid line of progress where we made lots of gains in terms of voting rights and women's rights and all of, issues around racial justice. So when I was at the University of Michigan, in the early 90s, we hit the peak of Black and Latino student enrollment back then. And so it felt wonderful to feel like, sort of the fruits of people's labors that had started in the 60s and moved forward coming to fruition. And then, sort of onto Obama and all of these things. And now we're in quite a different place. And so I think what I'm thinking is one, that there's so much work to be done, that I think that, you have to pick a place and start and understand that you want to do the work that's gonna endure, as opposed to doing the most. I think we can really fall, particularly now, when I talk to people feel really frantic because things are dire and there's so many things that are that need attention. But I am of the mind that I would rather see people do two things really well in a way that will last. When I look back 20 years at Pat Gurman, I think, wow, things that she did 20 years ago are still there. And she did, that I know of, it was 5 things or 3 things. It was not, sort of revolutionizing the world. And I think the sequential thing is great. Lay it out as a plan and an agenda. Make sure that it's shared and passed on. That, one of the things with students is you you move on, and you want to make sure that the students who are coming behind you are able to take up those same things, or you're able to take them up in different ways when you move on to where you're going. I think we also have to be honest that we're in the middle of a pandemic and everybody's exhausted. And you're not any good if you are so exhausted that you can't manage the things that you really need to, which is also why I just recommend to anybody who cares to ask, two things. Because it's a marathon, a super ultra marathon. And so I think you just have to be okay with not being able to fix everything, even though the whole world might seem out of control.
Stephanie, firstly, thank you for a fantastic presentation. And I think everybody knows, Stephanie's the provost at Columbia, and this is this is like a huge, big deal for us to have her speak to us and to visit with some old friends, at least virtually. You talked about, I was always a bit aware of the diversity of Michigan, but not to the extent that you described. And I know as faculty and students, we always talk about, we need a more diverse faculty, but we're obviously, if you look at our faculty, we're not doing a very good job of it. And what's your sense? I know it's not one thing because there's a lot of things that go into it, but is there some sort of secret sauces that go into this? Is it leadership at the university or the department, or how do we do better at this? Or would you have any thoughts on how we can do better at this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are no secrets. I think it's a lot of hard work and attention, and like really the answer is structure. So as opposed to good intentions, because psychology at Michigan looks totally different than just about any other department. So that was not a Michigan thing, for sure. Okay. That was a psychology at Michigan thing, and psychology has a long history dating back to the 1960s of having a large number of Black faculty in particular, that again came through leadership in psychology, but then these structures that they left. And so some of it was really, attention to tenure and promotion, thinking about how we frame research. So obviously not all people of color do work on people of color, but really thinking about how we frame research on race and gender, not as soft and those sorts of things. Who do we celebrate? So making sure that the folks who are doing really high quality work are celebrated and heralded. And so we had some specific structures, like we had a huge awards program where we actually had a whole awards committee, and they nominated something like 75 people for national awards. It was a ridiculous amount of work. I don't necessarily recommend going that far, but the point was that like every kind of competition out there, our faculty were into. So then the faculty were constantly winning awards, and especially thinking about awards that related to things like racial justice, community engagement, and that sort of thing. Being really forward thinking about research methods, about I felt like the ethos was always, whatever you're going to do, be the best at what you do, which is different from doing whatever that person over there is doing and trying to use those methods. We had some pretty forward-thinking diversity recruitment activities. We had a diversity recruitment, diversity postdoc that was really had some serious teeth in it, where if the person was recruited into the postdoc and was not offered a job, a tenure track job afterwards, then the department had to pay back some portion of that money. So So it was like, you
Wow.
better choose well, and you better choose someone you want to have around, and then you better train them to
Wow.
be around. And so offering those postdocs the same level of mentoring that we would offer to new assistant professors. Really very focused mentoring pipeline. We did all kinds of transition programs to support new students coming in, but also to get folks interested, just to get people to know about Michigan. We built lots of relationships. I've been to UNC to do recruitment, and part of those trips were really to say, hey, look at Michigan, we're fantastic and we're diverse. And then people very early on would say, oh, those Michigan people do these things. So, so really, a lot of advertising, a lot of internal work on mentoring, active recruitment, but also getting everybody to participate, I think, was another thing. And it was all institutionalized. There were line items in the department budget for certain kinds of things. Our undergraduate minority recruitment program, saying, we weren't looking around for money every year, because that's just what we did.
I bet that's huge. Thank you.
And Dr. Cooper raised her hand, used the cool feature. So go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie, for your talk. And so some of my question was answered in your response to David's question. And it was really around sort of thinking about that, for these things to be sustained, there has to be sort of this commitment to changing the structure, right? Meaning sort of the resources that are contributed. And so I know that Michigan, both the Department of Psychology and to some extent the university, has had a commitment to supporting or helping to implement and sustain some of those activities. So whether it's recruitment or retention of faculty. And so I think I have a question around what are the, in terms of your experience, both at Michigan, also now at your new institution, in terms of what are the ways in which for places that have a certain amount of resources, how to think about how to build those resources in a way that allows some of these activities to be sustained over time. And if we are very clear about the need for resources to sustain some of these and to have these things connect in a way that allow us to be truly transformative. And so I would appreciate both your experience at Michigan, but also just in terms of your experience in terms of how to cultivate those resources, but also how to make sure that they're sustained over time.
Yes, I think one of the things is I think oftentimes we think about diversity as like gravy. Like, yeah, it would be nice if we could, but the sort of meat and potatoes of what we do is over here. And so I think it goes back to James Banks's multiculturalism. So if we're starting at just the contribution level, at just the sort of hand wavy celebrating holidays, then it's not baked into the formula. And so some of what we did, even across the university, things like every search committee had to go through bias training. And this was good bias training, meaning like, how do you read an application for bias? We write about men and women differently, and how can search committees not get caught up on that? We tend to, reinvent ourselves by recruiting people only from our peer institutions, but we know that people of color, low-income folks, et cetera, are likely to go to less rigorous institutions for variety of reasons. So that was not extra, that was baked into the process of how every single person at the University of Michigan was recruited. Everyone had to go to that training. And it wasn't just about changing people's minds, it was about giving people tools. It was about saying, here's where we fall down, and here's how we put together, even our diversity postdoc. Part of what we did was we said, we're going to have a set of criteria that we use to so that we can uniformly review people. So if you think about recruitment of faculty, mentoring, if you have a separate line item, then it's easy to cut that off. If it is, really baked into to what you do, then I think that's less likely. I also think you have to step back and think about the commitment. So when I came here, Columbia, private institution. Nobody knows anything about anybody's salary, special deals, the whole thing. And I said, I am going to lead to equity through transparency. And people were like, oh, that's fantastic. Until people started coming to me asking for special deals. And I was like, oh, no, we don't have a special deal. There is no back door. You have to come in and apply for things just like everyone else. And so I think that, I think that you also have to say up front what your agenda is. And the budget is the very first place that you state your agenda, which means, what are you giving to first? And then what you see is the gravy. But, you also have to have folks in leadership positions who really value that, because it feels like you're taking away from other things only if you believe that diversity and excellence don't go hand in hand. Like diversity would be nice, but excellence is what's really important. But to me, you can't get to excellence without the diversity. And so, the diversity piece has to be part and parcel of the center of the budget, of course. I mean, I guess that's not as practical as it could be, but.
Thank you. I want to read out a question from the chat, just from Louisa. Thank you for your talk. Also, Go Blue. Could you talk a bit about some best practices for how we can evaluate our own progress in institutionalizing racial equity practices? For example, collecting our own data on our department versus bringing in outside individuals to facilitate audits on this progress.
Yeah, the data. I think that's really critical. I became a big believer of the use of data because I think that people, one, we're all using, the good intentions so often. And two, I think people literally just don't know. Like you get a sense of things and, we're psychologists. We know that people's senses are off all the time. The other thing is how do you improve if you don't have a solid idea of what the issues are? And how do you know what the issues are if you don't really dig in? So one of my favorite things, about I saw Andrea's comment and was laughing to myself. Hi, Andrea. Sorry, she's in my bottom corner there. One of the things that Michigan did that I'm trying to implement at Teachers College is a departmental review. So at Michigan, we would get a review from the graduate school every 4 or 5 years. And that would be all the data on things like retention and attrition of our students, who was applying, who was actually accepting the offers, how long were people taking to get through the program, and what kinds of products do they have? How many publications did people have when they finished? And then some like exit interview data from students who finished that would be about satisfaction, the level of mentoring, and those data all came disaggregated not by race, but it was sort of like underrepresented minorities versus others, international students, by gender. I may have chosen other categories if I was doing it, but the point was we would get a report that says, here's how you're doing in these different areas. Does this seem okay to you? And if not, what are you going to do to improve it? And we, the graduate school, are here to support you in doing this work. We have some tools that we can give you. So here's something that other people have done that was pretty effective when, in the Ed Psych program, when I was chair, we got our report And we found out that students of color were ending up with fewer publications at the end of their time. And so we put together some writing camps where we supported students in taking a paper from beginning to publication over the summer. And we did some writing mentoring activities. So without the data, I wouldn't have known that that was the thing. The other thing is we had a research center, the Center for the Study of Black Youth and Context, where we had a large collection of Black faculty. And some of the white students were saying that they felt like they had access to fewer resources if they weren't part of the center. And so we said, well, we certainly don't want that kind of inequity either. And so what are the things that we can do for students who aren't attached to a large research center that had a lot of resources? We found that our international students were saying were more likely to drop out than other students. And so we started a buddy system where we paired up the international students with another student, an older student, a continuing student, I guess you call, so that they would have a more smooth transition. And then we did some qualitative research. We asked the students what was happening in these different areas. This is, CPAP, by the way, was one of the programs that was incredibly diverse in terms of faculty and in terms of students. And students felt pretty good about being in the program. And so we could have just sailed along. But in fact, once we got the data, we said, oh, even though we're doing pretty well, there are some real gaps here. And so, our sense of things was actually a little off, and we were able to use the data to find some solutions to the problems that we weren't even aware of.
Thank you. I think Andrea had a question next.
Okay, let me jump in here. Hi, Stephanie. We miss you. I missed you, and it was. So here's my question for you. As the next level administrator, a new place, cozy, calm year that you've got here. There's a lot of talk about fundamental changes happening in the academy as we're having all of the changes happening at the societal level. And I wonder if there are ways that those rethinking of what we do in the academy and how and why we do it that might get pushed by the necessity of COVID, that might be pushed by that open some potential doors to be creative in making sure that social justice leads some of those changes. I'm just curious if there are potentials here to take advantage of that you are seeing as you're looking at a new place and all those structural issues.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of potential. So, as I talk to other people, I think one, it was shocking to learn so much about our students. I think so many faculty said, I had no idea that I had students who were food insecure, who, didn't have access to, housing, who were living, oh, the puppy. Sorry, should be more professional. But puppies go by, it's the best thing ever. But I think we had a real look at inequality in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And our conceptions of what our students were facing was just so wrong. And all of a sudden we couldn't ignore those things. So I think there's some great changes in terms of thinking about access for students with disabilities, for faculty with disabilities, for students from low-income backgrounds, language learning, like what happens in the context of Zoom that I think won't go away. I think, maybe because we were all stranded at home during lockdowns, that people had time to watch more news and learn more about the injustice that was happening. And I have seen a lot of movements. I think that is fantastic. I feel a little bit jaded, though, to be honest, that what I have seen is a lot of performance. I have seen a lot of, even after the news broke about George Floyd's murder, I was floored. As a new provost, I got emails from colleagues saying, is there anything I can do to help? Your job must be so hard. I've been needing to reach out to help you. And I'm thinking, but I'm the provost. Like, why do you think that I need help? Because somebody, because of this injustice in the world. And is that, clear charity in the moment where we're standing up for racial justice is the answer. And so, and a lot of, like, I think the healing and education is critical. I said that. But I think we're doing a lot of healing and a lot of education, a lot of book clubs. We're doing our own book club. We're doing a lot of things around the edges. And so the real question for me is what will stick? What will really be structural? So who is stepping back? I think we're doing a lot of the feel-good things, and we're not stepping back saying, let's look at those tenure and promotion guidelines again. It's not sexy, it's just not that exciting. And so, but it's where we need to start. Like, what are we doing in terms of admissions? And then what's happening once students and faculty get to the places where we are? Are we putting together policies that make sure that everyone has access to resources? And I worry a bit that there's going to be a lot of performance. I'm also encouraged by a lot of things at Barnard here, which is one of our sister institutions. They've started this. It's like a homeroom. They call it assembly, kind of like middle school. And every Monday they get together and talk about racial justice, which sounds like performance, except that it is a sustained space where people have to keep coming back and keep sort of doing the work, and where it is spinning off authentic action and not just sort of knee-jerk, willy-nilly action, but really sustained action. I have talked to Beth a little bit about some of the action you're taking at UNC, which is really exciting and impressive and kind of next level work. And so I applaud you for the work that you're doing. And sticking with it is hard. So as I was putting together my notes for our first faculty meeting, in my head, I kept thinking, oh, everyone's so tired. Oh, COVID. And, we have to figure out all of these things. Like, they're just constant. And sort of to Shauna's point, actually a faculty member said, yeah, this stuff is really important, but, where's the money for racial justice? And so how do we lead with racial justice even as we're exhausted? And I think the answer is you just lead with racial justice. And you say, if this is what we really care about, then that has to be where we start, and that's not the gravy. And so I told, the department chair, I was like, well, what else are you going to cut out? Can't cut out racial justice, can't stop thinking about, the climate and some of these other issues that we're currently faced with. So what's the administrivia that we're all caught up in that feels important, but that really isn't? I think we have to center what is really most important. And hopefully people will continue to do that even after the current long list of crises is over. And I should say we capture all these emails from other schools about what they're doing, and it all kind of looks the same. We have a conversation over here, doing a webinar over there, and that's not to belittle people's efforts. It's to say, I think it's time to really step back and dig in.
Another question from the chat. This might be the last one, or we might have time for one more, just to give people a heads up. This question is from Sophie. She's asking if you had any thoughts about improving recruitment of diverse talent to psychology at earlier stages in academic pipeline. For example, grad students, postbacs, or undergrads, and whether those mechanisms are the same or different as postgrad or faculty hiring.
Yeah, so this is, like I said, I think some of the things that UNC has been doing for a long time. still doing MURAP? Oh, good. Okay. Literally, some of our very best students came through MURAP. And I think, you know, it is true that that sometimes the pool is small. And I think that, you know, we have to work really hard to build the pipeline. But so I think a lot of the same principles hold in terms of, you know, really acting affirmatively, building the pipeline. So bringing people in, you know, these kinds of summer programs, I think, are really the cornerstone of diversifying our graduate programs, both because they can be an awesome way to say, look at UNC and all the great things we're doing, but then also giving people real tools. You know, I think this is one of the places where we lower the bar in terms of the challenges with applying for graduate schools. So we know that, you know, students of color, low-income students in particular, are left out of those mentoring structures where they get feedback on applications. And so, you know, just on the most superficial level, we can be helpful through doing those sorts of summer programs, giving students the tools to apply to graduate school, helping people to see themselves as scholars. And then once students get to graduate school, really providing high quality mentoring. And again, continuing to do the work of demystifying the academy. So one of the things that I cut from my talk was this tension between, like, this is like the most magical, amazing job I could ever imagine having. Like, I don't care how terrible things are at work. I have never gotten up and said, I don't want to be a professor. I do understand that lots of people have those thoughts for really good reasons. But I'm saying for me, it has just been really wonderful. But the academy is corrupt, you know, hard stop. It is not set up to be welcoming or supportive of people who are from marginalized backgrounds. And I have had an incredibly privileged life in the academy. Like, you just saw that, you know, my graduate school mentor was the student of the guy who built the first, you know, not to mention the other mentors I've had in my life. So, so it's easier, I think, in a lot of ways for me to have had a great experience. So I also think we need to do some work with that. I think we need to have honest conversations about what academic life is like, pros and cons, choices we're making. I think we don't have enough conversations with students about non-academic careers. We often present them as like consolation prizes. So if you can't make it in the academy, can't get a tenure track job, go do something non-academic. When a PhD is a research degree, you can do all kinds of research that does so many wonderful things for so many people, whether you're in an academic setting or not. You know, I think that part of what happens when we elevate tenure track jobs needlessly is that people in tenure track jobs feel special in ways that is erroneous. We're not specialer than anyone else, and but it also means that folks who choose other pathways, or folks who don't feel special, may feel like they can't be part of that club. So I said all that to say that I really think that there's so many scholars of color in particular who look at the academy, understand the corruption, the racism, systemic oppression, and say, there's no way I want to be part of that, and which is completely understandable. So one, I think the best way we can recruit people is to, you know, rid ourselves of systemic oppression and really think about the structures that we've built that lead to inequity. And, you know, but I also think that helping people understand the sort of pros and cons of the job, the pros and cons of other jobs, you know, helping people really understand what the day-to-day is and giving that entree, because I think so often, you know, scholars of students of color aren't getting the inside scoop. They aren't getting the mentoring. So there's sort of a double whammy of not feeling well prepared and feeling unwelcomed and left out. And so I think both are important.
Thank you so much.